There. Today's going to be an interesting topic, and today is not for the faint of heart. We're going to talk about a very difficult issue, but one that is necessary. And you remember the Me Too movement, I'm sure. You kind of couldn't miss it. I mean, people are still on trial and going to jail and things because of a lot of things that have come to light. And it's good that these things come to light. I'm sure there's been maybe some abuse on one side of that as well. On the other, well, there's obviously abuse on one side, but there's been, I think, some abuse on both sides. Aside from that, we focused on the women who have been mistreated, and we should. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget that women aren't the only victims of abuse. And so we're going to talk about some of that today. So hold on to your hat because this is a heavy topic, and we'll try to keep it, somewhere in the PG-13 range. But don't rely on me. I went out and got an expert on this topic. In fact, she is a retired police officer, and she now is a doctor of counseling psychology, and this is her book. It is called, that's not a book, sorry. She has a book out now called, that's her, Dr. Kelli Palfy, and she has a book called Men Too. You see what she did? She inserted the N into the Me Too movement to discuss the unspoken truths about male sexual abuse. And so Dr. Palfy is with me right now live. So you guys get ready wherever you're at. We'll take some questions if they're good questions. So chat is open. Jump on in here and we can talk about this topic. Dr. Palfy, how are you doing today?
I'm well, Randy. Thank you. And thank you for having me on. It is a real honor to be on your show.
Well, I appreciate you. And let's start from the top. I mentioned that you're a retired police officer and now doctor of counseling psychology. Give us a little bit of background on your life and what got you to where you're at today.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So that's correct. I was a RCMP officer for 13 years.
You're going to have to tell Americans what that is.
Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So the Federal Police Department. I guess you'd say it's our equivalent to the FBI. So I worked for 4 years in a unit called the Integrated Child Sexual Exploitation Unit, part of the Major Crimes Unit of the RCMP, which is the Behavioral Sciences Unit. Our unit came about because of a plethora of cases that came to light, actually via the United States. The U.S. Postal Service had noticed a bunch of suspicious parcels and engaged in a joint investigation with the Department of Homeland Security. And they investigated these parcels and found out that they contained illicit images of children. So a lot of the offenders who were known to have purchased these images were from Canada. So our unit developed in response to this. Sorry.
Yeah, so what were you doing? Were you going out and busting the bad guys?
Well, we helped with that, but we were sort of the body that created the templates for the warrants and stuff like that and trained the local investigators on how to deal with it. We did do some of that ourselves, yes. Also at the same time, Randy, there was legislation that came out in Canada that said any Canadian who traveled abroad for the purposes of exploiting a child could be charged as if they'd committed those crimes in Canada. So we were also responding to those cases. So yes, we responded to the cases, but we were also sort of the training body for a lot of the other smaller detachments in Canada, in BC specifically.
All right. And why did you get out of that and get into counseling psychology?
Well, that's a whole nother story. The short answer is I went through some significant bullying and harassment, and it was just time to get out. It's also sort of what brought me to do this type of work, because during that time in the child sexual exploitation unit, they were training me to be a subject matter expert. And part of that training was to listen to Sheldon Kennedy. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar who he is, but no. He's a former pro hockey player. He was one of the first men to ever come forward publicly about his abuse. So he came and gave us a private lecture. Now, he's now written a book about it, but this was well before his book. So he came and talked about the reasons why he hadn't disclosed. Reasons like he had grown up in poverty, and his potential career as a hockey player was literally lifting his family out of poverty. Everybody in his community was so proud of him for becoming this pro hockey player. His parents were so proud of him. He didn't want to disappoint them. And also, of course, he had this, he had a skill set and he had the opportunity to make it pro. And his coach, who was also abusing him, had the means to get him there. So, here he was living with this conflict, right? he also he also rec- that's okay. He also recognized that, this was the one that just broke my heart. He talked about how he felt like other players' parents should have suspected or should have known that something was going on and did nothing. So I just sat there. It just shocked me. I was so aware. I just became so aware that society has just failed men in this regard. And so here I am sitting there listening to him, and he talks about living this double life, right?
Yeah.
And that was the piece that really got me, Randy, because here I am in major crimes, like, on top of my career, so to speak, but I also felt like I was living a double life, right? Like, I was being bullied, so I'd go home and bawl my eyes out, yet have this facade at work, right? So I just related to that very, very small piece of this. And so fast forward a few years when I'm now doing my master's degree, yeah. I was really praying, honestly, for God to give me something else to be passionate about. And he just reminded me of Sheldon Kennedy, and I was like, yeah, I could get on board for being an advocate for men. It was something that I knew I could be passionate about.
Now, it's interesting that you as a woman are advocating for men. Was it just that one experience, or why are the men important to you? And that kind of is a dumb question, because everybody should be important to all of us, but you have focused on the abuse of men, and I don't know, it's a little bit of an interesting dynamic.
Absolutely, and I do get asked that a lot. It's not a dumb question.
Okay.
Yes, it was a large part based on Sheldon Kennedy's disclosure to us. But also, while I was investigating these child sexual exploitation cases, one of my supervisors just said to me, "Don't worry about the boys," and I didn't question that. And I mean, there's a lot of things to that answer or to that statement, but just sort of this realization that there's so few resources for men, right? Like, I mean, yes, you're right. We need to focus on the women who are being abused as well. But yes, I just really recognize that there's so few men that have support. Randy, before I became a police officer, I was a corrections officer, and I remembered wondering, why are there so many men in prison? Like, compared to women, why so many men? And, just based on what Sheldon Kennedy had said, I came to understand that one of the ways males deal with this is substance abuse, aggression, violence, that kind of thing, right? So it was just like God opened my eyes to this issue. There's a movie, Spotlight, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it talks about how the Boston Globe, I think it was, highlights the cleric abuse that was going on and how they discovered it. So my own discovery was similar to theirs. It was like the lights just went on.
So in writing the book, Men 2, what did you do to study it, and what did you find out?
Randy, I did everything possible. I took every little bit of training I could in regards to working with male survivors of sexual abuse. There's a conference that exists in Toronto every 2 years. I went 3 times. And then I went to to one of those type conferences and, threw up a poster and said, who wants to talk about it? And yeah, I had 13 men come forward and tell me their story. So my book, Men 2, Unspoken Truths, which this is the cover of, it tells the stories of these 13 men that I interviewed. So I talk about the very unique and complex barriers that these boys and men face throughout their entire lifetime. So what kept them from disclosing in their youth, what kept them disclosing in their adulthood, right? And what's interesting, Randy, is that the reasons changed as they grew and matured. So it's like a lifelong process, a lifelong struggle.
Tell us, give us an example if you can, keeping it appropriate for all audiences. Of one of the men that you talked to, one of the stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is discussed a lot more in my book, but a fairly, just unique example, or maybe not unique example would be better. I named him Aaron in the book. Of course, that's not his real name. But, he's 15, he's got a girlfriend, he goes off to summer camp, goes to this basketball camp, and the coach is a good friend of the family, and starts talking to Aaron while he's at camp. You're my best guy, you're my strongest player, you got a lot of talent and stuff. And then he asks him if he'd like to stay after camp to help him break down camp. He agrees, gets his parents' permission and everything, because this coach is a good friend of the family. So here he is, like 60 kilometers out in the middle of nowhere with this guy, and this is well before cell phones or anything like that. So, he's literally held captive by this guy, and he starts to treat him like more of a man, uses very, very, very typical grooming techniques, which I go through in detail in my book. But in this instance, he starts to treat him more like a man, tells him, things like, I think you should know about this kind of stuff already, and obviously introduces him to, pornography and that kind of stuff, and offers to teach him. So, here he is held captive by this guy for 3 days. He goes home, this guy says, thanks for letting me have your son, he did a great job, shakes the dad's hand, off he goes as if nothing happened. And Aaron is just like baffled. Like, he is so confused by the way this guy treats him at the end. And, he starts to question, like, was I willing? And he just felt like he couldn't tell his parents the truth because they were such good friends with this guy. He said it will break their hearts. So, yeah, that was,
So it's interesting that you say he started questioning himself, because that's what we hear with young girls. They start blaming themselves for the abuse that was perpetrated on them. Do you find that guys respond in some of the same ways, or all of the same ways, or is it different? How do men respond compared to women?
Yeah, and Randy, that wasn't 100% my area of focus, was how women respond, but definitely there's some similarities and some very unique differences. Well, first off, the way society looks at, boys and girls, right? Like, there's still this issue where, if a boy's abused, it's often confused as a coming of age experience, because they were groomed, they question their own willingness. This was really documented in the Michael Jackson documentary. These boys, they said they were in love with Michael Jackson, right? I know he was never convicted, but it's just a really good example of the confusion. So they develop a relationship with this fella, they come to trust them, their family trusts them, and then of course that relationship changed to be abusive. So yes, because they had an affection for their offender, they often question their own willingness. Because their bodies respond, sometimes they question their own willingness, and the reality is their bodies respond the way God designed their bodies to respond to stimulation. So, but it creates a lot of confusion.
What about the coping side of things? Do men internalize it? Do they act out, or does it just depend on the individual?
Yeah, Randy, there's a real variety of how they cope, right? So, a lot of boys cope through isolating themselves, and just try to tell themselves that it didn't affect them, which of course is not the case. It did affect them. Some turn to alcohol and drugs. Some turn to really hypermasculinity, kind of trying to prove to themselves they're not gay. Some turn to promiscuity, which I know women can do that too. But one of the big differences is, Randy, that in society nobody ever questions supporting a woman when they come forward, or a girl when they come forward. No one ever questions whether or not it's abuse, but oftentimes when a boy or a man comes forward, the response that they get is very different. Even their friends will say things like, oh, you should have enjoyed it, or she's hot, that I wish my teacher abused me, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now that raises another question, because you said something there. You said that guys they struggle with the homosexuality side of it if it was a male perpetrator on a boy. Who's doing this? Is this mainly men abusing boys, or are there women abusing boys? I know we've seen cases of teachers, and I'm reminded of the old, maybe you're old enough to remember this, the old Van Halen song "Hot for Teacher." It had the video and everything on MTV, right? There is this young boy fantasizing about older women kind of thing, but what's going on out there? I mean, is it men abusing boys, women abusing boys, or is it? Help me out here.
Okay, so part of the problem is that we don't really know 100% because boys don't talk about it. Least of all, boys don't talk about it, right? But yes, there are female offenders. I think somewhere between 10 and 30% are female offenders. I think it's much lower than males. So the bulk of the perpetration is done by males, but there are still female offenders, and it's very confusing for boys. Especially, you're right, Hollywood has really glamorized this idea of it as a coming of age experience versus abuse, right? Like, you don't see movies out there where a young girl's being abused by her teacher and you think of it as a good thing.
Right. There's a Mrs. Robinson for a reason, right? The old Dustin Hoffman movie. I'm really dating myself now.
Sorry.
So what do we do with this? How do we deal with this as a society?
Randy, I think where I'm coming from is that we have been missing this, but we don't have to miss it anymore. We can, like, this is what my research is about. My research is about why boys and men don't come forward. So we can do better. We can educate ourselves, right? Read my book. It's all about the reasons boys and men don't come forward. One of them being, the one that really surprised me, I guess, maybe because I'm not a parent, maybe it won't surprise parents out there. But one of the reasons boys and men don't talk about this is because they're protecting their parents from information they think will be too hard for them to handle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so educate ourselves. Another thing, which I know might be a bit controversial, but this comes from the boys and men that I interviewed, or the men that I interviewed. They say, if I would have known about this, if only I would have known about grooming techniques, right? If only I'd have known that sexual abuse is a thing for boys too, right? Or a thing, right?
Right, right.
Like they say, I could have stopped this sooner. I could have told somebody if I'd have known. So I think we need to do better as a society to create awareness, to talk about this. Randy, there's research that shows that boys and men don't talk about things that they don't hear other boys and men talking about. So we need to talk about it.
You mentioned grooming techniques a couple of times. Can you give us a couple of examples so that maybe if somebody's watching and they're wondering, did that happen to me, or is this happening to me or someone I know? Yeah. Give us some of those signs we can look for.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they'll typically insert themselves into a position where they have access to children to start off, unfortunately, teachers, coaches, the ministry as well, unfortunately. They'll befriend the family typically first. They'll fill a need, they'll fill a void. They will search out a void in the family to fill.
Okay, hang on. Let me pause you right there, because that's what a lot of people who are very good people will do as well.
Oh, and that's what's so yucky, right?
Yeah, I mean, so how do you know the difference between a youth minister who's doing his job, or a coach who really cares about the kids and wants to see them do their best, and someone who is grooming?
Randy, unfortunately, these guys, and you're absolutely right. The majority of coaches and teachers and pastors are amazing, and I don't want to sound like I'm saying they're not. But the reality is that perpetrators will insert themselves into these careers, kind of like the wolf dressed in sheep's clothing, right? Mm-hmm. So the reality is we might not know, right? But what we can do is educate our children. We can check in with them, just be aware of grooming tactics that, typically they're going to do things like, they're going to introduce, touch into the relationship, right?
Okay, yeah.
Obviously, typically it starts off, of course, non-sexual. Like they might tickle younger children or play tackle football with the boys. And I know this is hard for coaches too, right? Because obviously they're doing their job, and that's, of course, okay. But they're going to then try to separate and isolate from the crowd, right? Like a wolf in the wild, right? Separate, isolate, attack. So they're going to start saying, well, I'll take your son away for the weekend on a ski trip. I'm going. I want to teach him how to do these jumps. Or, so I guess the answer would be just watch for when they get back. Like, watch for sudden changes in behavior, right? So that's a big one, sudden changes in behavior. I think it's too easy to say, misattribute sudden changes in behavior to adolescence or becoming a teenager or something like that. But teens and adolescents don't typically have massive character changes just because they hit puberty, right? So really watch for that kind of thing.
Wait, you said you're not a parent, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I've had two boys and two girls, and it can be a little confusing at times. Honestly, sure. It can be, because they do go through mood swings, and
sure.
And suddenly the things they were interested in, they're not interested in, and they used to talk to you, and now they don't. They come home and they go straight to their rooms. So
for sure,
it can be easy, I think, for parents to not catch the warning signs. Let me ask you this, because you are a Christian. Mm-hmm. How important is it to have spiritual discernment when dealing with this?
Absolutely. Pray about it, for sure. God, educate yourself. God, what do you want me to say to my children? Who do you want me to protect, them from? Who do I need to be, obviously I totally believe in using the Holy Spirit. Listen to the Holy Spirit if it talks to you, for sure. But Randy, can I just go back just one piece? Like what you were describing there, to me, those are normal teenage behaviors, right? What I'm talking about is like extreme changes. Like they go from being a Christian who attends church to someone who's using drugs and alcohol and obviously very promiscuous and, running away from home, that kind of thing too, right?
Yeah, okay.
Like more extreme than what you're describing.
Okay. Well, no, that's absolutely good to know because especially if you, I didn't grow up in abuse. My wife didn't grow up in abuse. We would be completely ignorant to know some of those signs. How pervasive is this kind of thing?
Randy, it shocked me. I mean, I know you won't understand my reference because you don't know where I worked, but I used to say it's like the drug scene in Surrey. And I mean, Surrey has a big drug scene. Um, these guys are organized, they're connected. One of the things about male sexual abuse is that it's very prolific and predatory. So, one of the things that I did, which I talk about in my book, is to examine the research that was out there about what offenders say about their offending patterns. So, offenders, they did this research where they gave these offenders anonymity from prosecution and said, like, just tell us about your offending patterns. And so these guys, they admitted to 150 victims each over a lifetime.
Oh,
Yeah, so it's very predatory, right? And you're right, Randy, the reality is, you can't tell. It's not just vulnerable children that are being abused. It can happen to anybody, but I guess the thing is, like I say, Randy, the only solution that I can really think of is we need to start talking about it. We need to create room in society for boys and men to be victims too, to come forward and talk about it.
yeah.
We have, Randy, masculine principles traditionally say that boys don't experience sad emotions. Boys are allowed to protect themselves always. But it's just not true when you think about little boys, right? Like, little boys can't be expected to be adult men. So we have to sort of, make room for boys and men to, be able to express these sad emotions, be able to talk about these things. The research shows, Randy, that boys don't typically come forward, well, children don't typically come forward unless their parents or whoever they're speaking to create the right prompts and privacy for them to do that. So we need to create these environments where we have enough time for them to feel safe, and we maybe ask the right questions. Like, for example, I had a client that said that he didn't want to go back to daycare because he was being abused there, but he didn't have the language to describe that to his parents. So he said, I just told my mom I didn't want to go back. I didn't like the games they play. So a good question to ask will be, well, why don't you tell me about those games, honey, right? Like, what kind of games do they play, right? So not to just blow off your kids if they say things like that. And I know that's like so confusing, right? But just...
Yeah, well, it just takes a little work. In fact, that's one of the comments I wanted to ask you about. Someone watching right now live says if the child does not want to be around that person suddenly, and that could be true at school, in at church, or like you say, at daycare. If there's a very sharp, almost inexplicable change, that would that be a very big warning sign?
Absolutely. Time to dig in, time to ask questions, make space, like slow down, make some time to talk about those reasons, right?
Yeah, no doubt about it. Let me ask you this. Someone else has a comment, speaking from experience, unfortunately, and that the abuser was a neighbor and a police officer. How does the authority role, whether it's a pastor, teacher, police officer, play a part of abusers?
Absolutely, that's huge, Randy, right? They can, I mean, obviously threats and violence are often a part of male abuse. It can leave a boy absolutely paralyzed to come forward, right? Even if it wasn't the authority figure, boys can be afraid to come forward. One of the men that I interviewed said that when he was a boy, he was being abused by his father, and he had been wrongfully accused of doing a break-in, and he'd been interrogated by the police. So when he became old enough to recognize that what was happening to him was sexual abuse, he was too terrified to go to the police because he already had been wrongfully accused. So yeah, Randy, I mean, we call it sanctuary abuse when you're abused by someone you're supposed to be able to trust. It's the worst.
Well, okay, and you mentioned family. That's something we haven't talked about. Do we have any idea how much of that is coming from inside the family versus outside the family, and how do you recognize that, and then how do you, because that can destroy a family.
Absolutely.
Obviously, if it's true, but even if it's not true, but the accusations come up.
Sorry, Randy, that was a bit of a two-part question. I'm just gonna give you what my research showed. Like, I interviewed 13 men. 6 of them were assaulted by bio parents. 2 of them, it started very young by their mothers. 1 very young by their father. So others in their teenage years by their fathers. So just tragic, right? And yes, you're right. Ministers, police officers, some of these people who are authority figures in society and spiritual authority figures. Yeah, I mean, and that, Randy's a good point, which was sort of one of the reasons that some of the men that I spoke to said they didn't come forward as boys, right? Like, if I report on my father, what's going to happen to my mother, right? If dad goes to jail, how's mom going to pay the bills? If dad goes to jail and the family gets broken up, what happens if my brothers and sisters get sent to foster care? Things could be worse in foster care, right? Another one said, like, who's going to pay for university if I report on my parents, right?
Yeah. A lot of difficulties. So what do men do? What do young boys do? What are the steps towards rectifying the situations and healing those who have been victims?
Randy, I'm going to use the voice of one of the men that I spoke to. One thing he said is talk about it. And he said, if the first person you tell doesn't listen, tell somebody else, right? There is help out there. There are organizations out there now that will believe you. So yeah, if the first person you talk to doesn't give you the right response, go tell somebody else.
Yeah. Well, talk to me a little bit about the book. What are people going to get when they open up Men Too?
Yeah, so Randy, this book just came out January 15th, so I'm just starting to get response from people who've read it. Overall, everybody is telling me it's really opened their eyes. People are telling me that once they start reading it, they can't put it down because it's kind of shocking what they're learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm just like, my goal is creating awareness and supporting male survivors. So yeah, I mean, people are going to get new information about how to recognize boys as victims, new information about, I give ideas about how to talk to boys about grooming techniques and how to create awareness. I talk about the different types of sex offenders and their different approach to targeting males, just the prevalence rates, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Just awareness.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you taking the time to do the research, to put it into a book, and to just get out there and talk about it and raise the awareness, because I think you're right. The unspokenness of it is its greatest cloak, you know. Is there anything else that you need to talk about, we need to talk about, that we haven't covered today?
Randy, I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned, like, part of my research involved looking at what was out there prior to my research. So there was research out of Iceland. I would say it was appropriately titled Deep and Unbearable Suffering, the Consequences of Childhood Sexual Abuse on Men's Mental Health and Well-Being. A long title, something like that. But it looked at the experiences of 14 Icelandic men. So all of these men had lived their entire lives with profound depression. And all of them said that they came to this impasse where they were either going to kill themselves or talk about it. So that research just breaks my heart, right? Because it obviously begs the question, how many people chose the alternative, right? You know, Randy, I looked up research from the United States, and I don't know if it's accurate, but the place where I looked said in 2018 there were 48,000 suicides in the U.S. and 48,000 completed suicides in the U.S. in 2018. 3.5% males versus females. So we can do better. Like, I guess, you know, to me it just, like I said, begs that question, could this be why, right?
Yeah, I have no doubt that it's a part of it. No doubt at all. One more quick question. Someone online is asking, do you know if any of the men went to jail, or it would be women? In other words, the people that you talk to, specifically in your book, but have the parents or the abusers, were they prosecuted, or are they still out walking the streets and abusing people?
Good question. I believe, you know, Randy, being a former police officer, it's all kind of confused in my mind, but I believe that Aaron's offender went to jail for a bit. Yeah, I remember, because he said his offender sent his entire family postcards saying he was on sabbatical in Europe when he was in jail. So I know at least his offender went to jail, but it wasn't a question I even asked, so I'm sorry I can't give you that answer. But I mean, one thing I'd like to say for Canadians listening is that in Canada, we do not have a statute of limitations on offenses. Unfortunately, in the United States, I believe you do. And
a lot of states have been changing those laws and opening them up.
Awesome. Thank you, God.
So it's never too late, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So get out there, talk about it. If seriously, if you have been a victim of abuse, well, let me ask you this. I know what I would say. What would you say to someone who has been a victim?
You're not alone. You didn't ask for this. There is help available. Yeah, like I said, this whole idea of if someone you tell the first time doesn't listen, tell someone else.
Yeah.
There's help out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is find somebody that can help walk you through the process who has a little bit of an outside perspective to help you make better choices as you expose the person who has done this to you, because they need to be held accountable. And they need to be held accountable by the legal system, not just by you one-on-one. Let me ask you one more question. I know I'm going to keep going.
Good.
As a Christian, we forgive, right? We turn justice over to God ultimately, but yet we also recognize the role of government to hold people accountable. I don't doubt that a lot of people are twisted up in unforgiveness because their abusers never went punished. In other words, their abusers have gone unpunished or have died and were never held accountable. How do we, as a psychologist, how would you talk to someone who feels like they never got the justice they deserved?
Yeah. Well, Randy, for one thing, I tell them we don't know how it ends for these people, right? God, and I think forgiveness sort of gets a bad rap, right? Like, it's not the cliche forgive and forget. God, first off, I want to say it's not God's will that anybody be abused, right? A lot of people sort of let go of their faith because they think that it was God's will that they were abused. That is a lie. That is not true at all. God, he mourns over people's abuse. He wants to heal. But my understanding, and please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, but my understanding of biblical forgiveness is exactly what you said. It's like biblical forgiveness is not necessarily even for the offender, it's for you, so that you can stop holding on to this desire to get revenge. Because the reality is, Randy, that there's nothing we can do on earth that would ever satisfy to get revenge. So biblical forgiveness is saying, okay, God, I give this to you. You get revenge if you want to. I wash my hands of this, right? And so from that place, it's like you get to let go of it. You get to stop holding on to this anger and this desire to get revenge. Like I said, no revenge would ever be good enough. So you give it up to God, leave it in his hands. It's a tough one, though, obviously, right?
It is, but I also do think that it is right to let government take their role and punish offenders. In other words, if your offender is still out there,
Absolutely.
Then yeah, and changing, when you talk about the statute of limitations and there not being one for these types of crimes in Canada, great. Yeah. We're getting rid of some of those laws down here, but you can always, even if they don't get, thrown in jail, exposing someone. I would do it with a counselor with you, because every situation is different, and there are nuances. There's also the pain that you're dealing with that can cloud your judgment. So I would always recommend that you have someone there with you to walk you through this. But yeah, don't go at it alone. In other words, but you can forgive someone and still hold them. They can still be held accountable. You can expose someone and forgive someone. You can draw boundaries to where you're not around them and forgive someone. The forgiveness is, again, like you say, it is so that I don't have to carry the burden of the wrong you've done to me. It's not letting someone off the hook. It's putting them on God's hook, and I think the legal system.
Yeah, absolutely, Randy. And the bottom line is that sometimes the only way to get these guys to stop offending is to put them behind bars. So I'm all for that. I mean, I worked for 4 years doing exactly that. I was the file coordinator for the RCMP's first sex tourism case, and my guy got 11 years, and I had no problem with that.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, Dr. Kelli Palfy, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and for speaking out, and for taking half an hour, a little more, because we could probably go another half hour and getting some interesting comments. But I do appreciate the work you're doing, and pray that you would keep doing it, keep helping people, and keep shedding light into the darkest of situations.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, and to all of you out there, again, if this is something that you've been dealing with, or you've been impacted by, or you talk. The number one thing I think you heard today is talk to somebody. Get it out into the light. Don't let the things in the darkness continue. Get it out there. Find support, find healing, find legal assistance, but get it out there, talk about it, don't just let it go. And it's not just women, but it is men too. And the book is available. It's out there, so you can find it easily. Go online, pick it up if it'll help you. It will help you, so it'll give you some good guidelines, so I urge you to check that out as well. And that's it. I hope this has helped some people. If you think someone needs to see this, please do share it with them. And if you're new to Life Today Live, please come back, subscribe, whichever place you're out there watching today. Subscribe, like, follow, whatever the thing is that you do there, and come back. We will continue to help you in lots of different areas, because that's what we're here for. We're here for your support, your conversation, your spiritual growth. We'll see you next time on Life Today Live.